The red dust of Burkina Faso swirled like ancestral spirits awakening from their eternal slumber, carried by the harmattan winds that had witnessed empires rise and fall across the Sahel. In the village of Pa, where the baobab trees stood as silent guardians of time immemorial, the earth itself seemed to pulse with newfound purpose. Beneath the cracked laterite soil, beneath the roots that had drunk from this land for centuries, lay a treasure that would either liberate or damn the children of Thomas Sankara. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood at the edge of the excavation site, his military fatigues dust-stained, his eyes reflecting the weight of a nation's destiny. The morning sun painted his dark skin in shades of bronze and determination, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the oil derricks rising like metallic prayers against the azure sky. At 34, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had seen too much, learned too quickly, and now bore the burden of choosing between his people's future and the seductive whispers of foreign gold. "Capitaine," called out Aminata Ouedraogo, her voice cutting through the mechanical hum of drilling equipment. She approached with the confident stride of a woman who had earned her place among men through intellect and unwavering resolve. As Burkina Faso's Minister of Natural Resources, she had been the first to recognize the magnitude of their discovery, not just oil, but enough crude to transform their landlocked nation from one of the world's poorest into a regional powerhouse. Her traditional Bogolan cloth wrapped around her shoulders like a mantle of authority, the mud-dyed patterns telling stories of resistance and resilience that her grandmother had whispered to her in the flickering light of cooking fires. "The American delegation has arrived in Ouagadougou," she reported, her more accented French carrying undertones of both anticipation and apprehension. "They're requesting an immediate audience." Traoré nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the horizon where the sun seemed to balance on the edge of the world. "And what do our ancestors whisper in your dreams, ma sœur?" he asked, using the familiar term that acknowledged their shared struggle for national sovereignty. Aminata's laugh carried the musicality of her people, a sound that had survived slave ships and colonial administrators that had echoed through the compounds of Ouagadougou for generations. "They remind me that the white man's friendship comes with chains made of contracts and debt," she replied. "But they also warn that isolation can be another form of imprisonment." The oil discovery had been accidental. A water well project funded by a small Chinese consortium had struck black gold instead of the precious water they sought. Within weeks, geological surveys confirmed what seemed impossible. Burkina Faso sat atop one of West Africa's largest untapped oil reserves. Conservative estimates suggested at least 2 billion barrels of high-quality crude, enough to generate hundreds of billions in revenue over the coming decades. But with discovery came the vultures. The conference room in Ouagadougou's presidential palace had been transformed into an arena where the fate of nations would be decided. The mahogany table, carved by local artisans and inlaid with traditional mossy symbols, served as a battleground between competing visions of Burkina Faso's future. On one side sat the American delegation, pale men in expensive suits who carried themselves with the casual arrogance of those accustomed to having their way. Their leader, James Whitmore, represented a consortium of oil companies whose combined revenue exceeded the GDP of most African nations. Across from them, Traoré sat flanked by his closest advisors, each one a product of Burkina Faso's soil and struggle. To his right, Aminata reviewed documents with the precision of a woman who had learned to read between the lines of every contract. To his left, General Ousmane Ouedraogo, the grizzled veteran whose scars told stories of Chad, Mali, and the eternal fight against those who would exploit African weakness. "Captain Traoré," Whitmore began, his voice carrying the smooth cadence of boardroom negotiations, "we're prepared to offer Burkina Faso unprecedented prosperity. Our consortium can provide immediate infrastructure development, job creation, and revenue streams that will transform your nation within a decade." The American's French was flawless, betraying years of experience in African negotiations. He slid a folder across the table with the confidence of a man who had never been refused. "We're talking about a $40 billion investment over the next 20 years. Roads, hospitals, schools, refineries, all built with American expertise and technology." Traoré's fingers traced the edge of the folder without opening it. In the silence that followed, the distant sound of Ouagadougou's traffic, motorcycles, cars, and the occasional donkey cart, served as a reminder of the world beyond this air-conditioned room. "And in return?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of historical precedent. "Standard partnership terms," Whitmore replied smoothly. 70-30 revenue split in your favor, with operational control remaining with our consortium. We handle extraction, refining, and international marketing. You collect checks and watch your nation prosper." General Sawadogo's laugh was sharp as a blade. 70-30, he repeated, his voice thick with the accent of the rural north. Like Nigeria 70-30? Like Chad 70-30? Like every other African nation that discovered oil and remained poor while foreign companies built mansions in Houston and London. The American's smile never wavered. General, I understand your skepticism, but this is 2025, not 1960. We're partners, not colonizers. Our success depends on Burkina Faso's success. Partners? Aminata interjected, her voice carrying the musical quality that made even challenges sound like poetry. Tell me, Monsieur Whitmore, how many African nationals sit on your consortium's board of directors? How many Burkinabe engineers will lead your extraction operations? How many of our young people will you train to eventually run these facilities themselves? Whitmore's pause was barely perceptible, but in that moment of hesitation, Traoré saw everything he needed to know. We would certainly consider qualified candidates for appropriate positions, the American replied, the smoothness of his tone unable to mask the emptiness of his promise. Appropriate positions, Traoré repeated, finally opening the folder. The documents inside were written in English, with French translations that carried the sterile language of legal domination. Revenue projections, environmental impact assessments, employment estimates, all painted a picture of Burkina Faso as a resource extraction site rather than a sovereign nation. Captain, Whitmore leaned forward, his blue eyes intense with the fervor of a man accustomed to closing deals. I've negotiated similar agreements across Africa. Madagascar, Senegal, Ghana, all have prospered under our partnerships. We bring stability, expertise, and capital that no domestic operation could match. The mention of other African nations hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Each country named carried its own story of broken promises and environmental devastation, of oil wealth that enriched foreign shareholders while local populations remained trapped in poverty. That evening, as the red sun disappeared behind the acacia trees that dotted Ouagadougou's landscape, Traoré found himself in the compound of his grandmother, Mama Fatimata. The old woman sat on her traditional mat, grinding millet with the same wooden pestle her mother had used, her movements rhythmic as ancient prayers. At 93 she had lived through French colonial rule, independence, multiple coups and the brief, shining moment when Thomas Sankara had dared to dream of an Africa that belonged to Africans. Numa, she called him by his childhood name, her voice carrying the authority of accumulated wisdom. You carry the weight of the ancestors in your eyes tonight. Traoré knelt beside her, accepting the bowl of millet porridge she offered. The compound was filled with the sounds of evening, children playing, women preparing the evening meal, men discussing the day's work. 3 generations of his family lived here, from great-grandchildren learning to walk to elders who remembered when Burkina Faso was still called Upper Volta. The Americans want our oil, Mama, he said, reverting to the Moor language of his childhood. They promise prosperity, but their contracts speak of domination. Mama Fatimata's weathered hands never stopped their grinding. And what do you hear in their promises, my child? The same words the French used when they said they came to civilize us. The same words the World Bank uses when they offer loans with conditions that bind us tighter than chains. The old woman nodded slowly. Your father, may Allah rest his soul, used to say that when a stranger offers to help you harvest your crops, first count your seeds. When he offers to help you sell them, count your money. When he offers to help you plant them, count your children. Traoré's uncle, Burima, approached carrying a calabash of dolo, the traditional millet beer that had been brewed in these compounds for centuries. He was a man of the soil, his hands permanently stained with the red earth of Burkina Faso, his face lined with the wisdom of seasons and harvests. I heard the white men's promises on the radio, Burima said, settling onto his haunches beside them. They speak of jobs, but will our sons work the machines or merely guard them? They speak of schools, but will they teach our children to think or merely to obey? The question hung in the air like incense from evening prayers. Across the compound, Traoré's young cousin Seydou sat with his friends, their faces illuminated by the glow of mobile phones, a generation caught between tradition and modernity, between the wisdom of their ancestors and the allure of a globalized world. Thomas Sankara used to say, Mama Fatimata continued, her voice taking on the cadence of oral tradition, that he who feeds you controls you. If we let foreigners extract our oil, transport our oil, refine our oil, and sell our oil, then we are merely servants in our own house. But Mama, Traoré replied, his voice carrying the weight of contemporary realities, we lack the technology, the expertise, the capital to develop these resources ourselves. Without foreign investment, the oil remains buried while our people remain hungry. The old woman's eyes, clouded with cataracts but bright with understanding, fixed on her grandson. When the baobab tree grows, does it ask the acacia for permission? When the river flows, does it wait for the rock to move? Power, my child, comes not from what others give you, but from what you refuse to surrender. 3 days later, Traoré stood before a gathering of traditional chiefs, religious leaders and community representatives in the sacred grove outside Pavillage. The baobab trees that surrounded them had witnessed the rise and fall of the mossy kingdoms, had sheltered griots who sang the genealogies of kings, had provided shade for the councils that governed these lands long before Europeans drew lines on maps. The discovery site lay just beyond the grove, where the red earth had been torn open to reveal the black gold beneath. The contrast was stark. Ancient trees that had stood for centuries facing modern machinery that promised to reshape the landscape forever. Chief Naba Kango, descendant of the Mossy rulers who had resisted colonial conquest longer than most, spoke first. His voice carried the authority of tradition and the weight of responsibility for future generations. The spirits of this land are uneasy, he declared, his words translated from Moor to French for the assembled crowd. They whisper of great changes coming, of wealth that could either bless or curse our children. The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices blending with the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of drilling equipment. Women in colorful pagnis sat in traditional circles, their children playing in the dust at their feet. Men leaned against the massive trunks of the baobabs, their faces reflecting the uncertainty of a people standing at the crossroads of history. Imam Umaru Dikko, the respected Islamic scholar whose words carried weight across the Sahel, rose to speak. His white robes seemed to glow in the dappled sunlight filtering through the leaves. The Quran teaches us that the earth's resources are a trust from Allah, he said, his Arabic-accented French carrying the melody of scriptural recitation. We are not owners but stewards, responsible for using these gifts wisely and justly. But who will ensure justice? Called out Mariam Compere, a women's rights activist whose voice had become synonymous with the fight for equality in rural communities. If we allow foreign companies to extract our oil, will the revenue build schools for our daughters or mansions for their executives? The question sparked animated discussion throughout the crowd. Voices rose in Moor, Diola and French, creating a linguistic symphony that reflected Burkina Faso's diversity. Elderly women shared memories of colonial exploitation, while young men debated the merits of foreign investment versus national sovereignty. Traoré listened to each voice, understanding that the decision he made would echo through generations. In the animated discussions, he heard the wisdom of his people, their deep understanding of justice, their suspicion of foreign promises, their desperate hope for a better future. My people, he finally said, rising to address the assembly. His voice carried across the grove, cutting through the debates and drawing all attention to his words. We stand at a moment that will define our nation's future. The choice before us is not simply between accepting or rejecting foreign investment. It is between remaining subjects in our own land or becoming masters of our own destiny. The crowd fell silent, the only sounds the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant call of birds. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, their games forgotten as they watched the man who held their future in his hands. I have heard the Americans' promises, Traoré continued, his words measured and deliberate. I have also heard the warnings of our ancestors. Both speak truth, but neither speaks the whole truth. He paused, allowing his words to settle in the minds of his audience. The Americans offer expertise we lack, capital we need, and markets we cannot access alone. But they also seek to control what belongs to us, to extract our wealth while leaving us dependent on their charity. Chief Naba Kango nodded slowly, his weathered face reflecting understanding. And what path do you propose, my son? A third path, Traoré replied, his voice gaining strength. We will develop our oil resources, but we will do so as partners, not as subjects. We will learn their technology, but we will not surrender our sovereignty. We will accept their investment, but we will not accept their domination. The Chinese delegation arrived in Ouagadougou like a desert storm, swift, powerful, and carrying the promise of transformation. Unlike their American counterparts, they came not with the polished arrogance of established power but with the patient confidence of those who understood the long game of geopolitical chess. Ambassador Li Wei, a man whose diplomatic smile masked decades of experience in African negotiations, met with Traoré in the presidential palace. The conference room had been rearranged, gone were the formal opposing sides of the American meeting, replaced by a circular arrangement that suggested partnership rather than confrontation. Captain Traoré, Li Wei began, his French carrying the careful precision of someone who had learned the language in service to his nation's interests. China has watched Burkina Faso struggle for sovereignty with great interest. We remember our own fight against foreign domination, our own journey from exploitation to empowerment. Beside him sat Dr. Chin Mei, a petroleum engineer whose expertise had helped develop oil fields across Africa and Asia. Her presence sent a clear message: China came prepared to share knowledge, not merely extract resources. We offer a different model, Li Wei continued, sliding a folder across the table. Joint venture partnerships where Burkina Faso retains majority ownership, technology transfer programs that train your engineers and technicians, and infrastructure development that serves your people's needs, not merely our extraction requirements. Traoré studied the documents, noting the stark differences from the American proposal. Where the Americans offered a 70-30 split in Burkina Faso's favor, the Chinese proposed a 60-40 split in China's favor, but with a crucial difference. After 10 years, ownership would transfer to a 70-30 split favoring Burkina Faso, and after 20 years, complete ownership would transfer to the Burkinabe people. Your terms appear more generous than our American friends, Traoré observed. But generosity in international relations often comes with hidden costs. What does China truly want from this partnership? Dr. Chin leaned forward, her engineering mind appreciating the directness of the question. Captain, we want oil, yes. But we also want stability in West Africa, trading partners who can purchase Chinese goods, and allies who understand that development comes through cooperation, not domination. Aminata, who had been quietly studying the technical specifications, looked up with interest. Your proposal includes a petroleum institute to train Burkinabe engineers. How many students would be educated, and to what level? Initially, 50 students per year would study in Beijing, with full scholarships and guaranteed employment upon return, Dr. Chin replied. Additionally, we would establish a technical college here in Ouagadougou, staffed by Chinese and Burkinabe faculty, capable of training hundreds of technicians annually. General Sawadogo, ever suspicious of foreign promises, asked the question that hung in the air. And if we disagree with Chinese policies in the future? If our interests diverge? What happens to our oil industry then? Li Wei's smile never wavered, but his eyes reflected the steel of someone who had navigated far more treacherous diplomatic waters. General, China's philosophy is simple. Mutual benefit creates lasting partnerships. If Burkina Faso prospers, China prospers. If you fail, we fail. Our investment in your success is our investment in our own future. The meeting continued for hours with technical discussions about extraction methods, environmental protections, and revenue-sharing mechanisms. Unlike the American delegation which had presented a take-it-or-leave-it proposal, the Chinese team showed willingness to negotiate, to adapt their terms to meet Burkinabe concerns. But Traoré knew that choosing between American and Chinese proposals was itself a form of surrender. Each offered a different form of dependency, a different path to the same destination: foreign control over Burkina Faso's resources and future. Late that night, Traoré walked the streets of Ouagadougou, escorted by a small security detail but otherwise unremarkable among the city's evening crowd. He passed the monument to Thomas Sankara, where flowers and offerings appeared daily from citizens who remembered the revolutionary leader's dream of an Africa that belonged to Africans. The capital city pulsed with the rhythm of modern Africa, street vendors calling out their wares, young people gathered around small televisions watching football matches, families sharing meals under the stars. In the midst of this vibrant life, Traoré felt the weight of decision pressing down like the harmattan dust that coated everything in its path. He stopped at a small maquis, one of the informal restaurants that served as community gathering places throughout the city. The owner, a woman known as Tantai Awa, recognized him immediately but offered no special treatment beyond the respect due to any customer. He ordered two with groundnut sauce and sat among farmers, mechanics, and day laborers who discussed the oil discovery with the passion reserved for football and politics. "They say the white men want to make us rich," said Boubacar, a motorcycle taxi driver whose weathered hand spoke of years navigating Ouagadougou's chaotic traffic. "But my father remembered what the French promised when they built the railway. They said it would bring prosperity, but it only brought their soldiers and tax collectors. And now the Chinese make similar promises," added Fatou, a market woman whose sharp eyes had evaluated countless customers seeking to cheat her. "They build roads and hospitals, yes, but they also bring their own workers, their own managers, their own ways of doing business." Traoré listened to their conversation, understanding that these voices represented the soul of Burkina Faso. people who had survived colonialism, coups and economic collapse through their own resilience and community bonds. Their skepticism was not ignorance but wisdom earned through generations of broken promises. Captain Traoré said, approaching his table with the confidence of someone who had fed half the city's political elite. My customers debate your decision every night. Some say accept the Americans, others say trust the Chinese. But I wonder, why must we choose between masters? Her question cut through the complexity of international negotiations to the heart of the matter. Why indeed must Burkina Faso choose between different forms of foreign control when the oil belonged to the Burkinabe people? Because Captain Traoré replied, we lack the knowledge and capital to develop our resources alone. Without foreign partnership, the oil remains in the ground while our people remain poor. The restaurant owner's laugh carried the musical quality of West African women, melodious but knowing. When my daughter learned to cook, did I do all the work while she watched? Or did I teach her step by step, letting her make mistakes, guiding her hands until she could cook alone? The simplicity of her analogy struck Traoré with the force of revelation. Why accept permanent junior partnership when Burkina Faso could learn, grow, and eventually control its own resources? The next morning, Traoré convened an emergency meeting of his cabinet. The conference room buzzed with tension as ministers, advisors, and technical experts gathered to hear their leader's decision. Outside, the oil discovery had attracted international media attention, with CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera reporting on the potential transformation of one of the world's poorest nations. My colleagues, Traoré began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had made a difficult decision. After careful consideration of all proposals and extensive consultation with our people, I have decided to reject both the American and Chinese offers. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Aminata leaned forward, her face reflecting both surprise and interest. Captain, without foreign partnership, how do we develop our oil resources? Through selective partnerships, Traoré replied, his words measured and deliberate. We will not surrender control of our resources to any single foreign power. Instead, we will invite multiple partners to compete for limited contracts, maintaining Burkina Faso's sovereignty over all operations. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city that would either prosper or suffer based on the choices made in this room. Norwegian expertise for offshore drilling technology, Canadian environmental protection systems, Brazilian refining knowledge, South African mining experience. We will learn from the best while maintaining control over our own destiny. General Ouagadougou smiled for the first time in days. A coalition of partners rather than a single master. But such an approach requires significant coordination and management capabilities. Do we possess such expertise? We will develop it, Traoré replied firmly. We will establish a National Petroleum Institute, staffed by Burkinabe citizens trained in the world's best facilities. We will create joint ventures with multiple international partners, but always with Burkina Faso maintaining majority control. The Minister of Finance, Dr. Boukari Ouagadougou, raised a crucial concern. Such an approach requires enormous initial investment. Without a major partner providing upfront capital, how do we fund the initial infrastructure development? Traoré had anticipated this question. We will issue sovereign bonds backed by our proven oil reserves. International investors will provide capital in exchange for guaranteed returns, but without operational control. Additionally, we will seek development financing from multilateral institutions committed to sustainable development. The room fell silent as the implications of this ambitious plan sank in. Rather than choosing between American and Chinese domination, Burkina Faso would chart its own course. More difficult, certainly, but potentially more rewarding in the long term. Aminata was the first to speak. This approach will require unprecedented coordination and expertise. We must move carefully, ensuring that our desire for independence doesn't lead to operational chaos. Agreed, Traoré replied. We will implement this plan in phases, beginning with a pilot project involving our most promising oil field. If successful, we will expand the model to full-scale operations. The rejection of the American proposal triggered an immediate and predictable response. Within hours of Traoré's announcement, the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou released a statement expressing disappointment with Burkina Faso's decision and warning of potential economic consequences for choosing an untested and risky development path. The language was diplomatic, but the message was clear. Nations that rejected American partnership could expect American opposition. James Whitmore, the consortium leader, requested an emergency meeting with Traoré. The American's polished demeanor had been replaced by barely concealed anger and frustration. "Captain, you're making a catastrophic mistake," he said, his voice carrying the edge of someone unaccustomed to rejection. "Without proven expertise and established infrastructure, your oil development program will fail. When it does, the Chinese will be waiting to pick up the pieces at a fraction of the cost." Traoré's response was measured but firm. "Monsieur Whitmore, Burkina Faso appreciates your concern, but we have chosen the path of sovereignty over the path of dependency. History will judge whether we chose wisely." Within days, the consequences of rejecting American partnership became apparent. The World Bank, heavily influenced by American policy, announced delays in reviewing Burkina Faso's applications for infrastructure development loans. The IMF expressed concerns about the nation's financial stability in light of its ambitious but unproven oil development strategy. International credit rating agencies, responding to pressure from major investors, placed Burkina Faso on negative watch, making it more expensive for the nation to borrow money in international markets. The message was clear. Countries that refused to play by established rules would face economic isolation. But Traoré had anticipated this response. Working with Aminata and a team of international financial experts, Burkina Faso began exploring alternative funding sources. Islamic development banks, Chinese policy banks, and sovereign wealth funds from other oil-producing nations showed interest in supporting an African-led development model. "They want to punish us for choosing independence," Aminata observed during one of their late-night strategy sessions. "But their punishment reveals the weakness of their position. If their partnership terms were truly beneficial, they wouldn't need to threaten us for rejecting them." The Chinese response was more subtle but equally significant. Ambassador Li Wei requested a private meeting with Traoré, ostensibly to discuss ongoing cooperation opportunities, despite the rejection of the major oil deal. "Captain," Li Wei said, his diplomatic smile intact but his eyes reflecting careful calculation, "China respects Burkina Faso's decision to chart its own course. We hope this doesn't preclude future cooperation in other areas." The subtext was clear. China could be either a partner or a competitor, but it would not be ignored. Unlike the Americans, who relied on economic pressure and institutional leverage, China's approach was more patient but equally determined. As international pressure mounted, Traoré decided to take his case directly to the Burkinabe people. Rather than governing through backroom negotiations and diplomatic communiques, he would seek a popular mandate for his chosen path. The town hall meeting in Ouagadougou's largest stadium drew thousands of citizens from across the nation. Farmers traveled from rural villages, urban workers left their jobs, and students abandoned their studies to participate in what many saw as a defining moment in their nation's history. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation and anxiety. Traditional drummers provided rhythm for the gathering, their instruments echoing across the stadium like heartbeats of the nation. Women in colorful pagnies sat alongside men in traditional grand boubous, creating a visual tapestry of Burkina Faso's diversity. Traoré took the stage without fanfare, dressed in simple military fatigues that emphasized his connection to the people rather than the trappings of power. His words, delivered in alternating French and more, carried the cadence of traditional storytelling. "My people," he began, his voice carrying across the stadium without amplification, "we stand at the crossroads of our history. The path we choose today will determine whether our children inherit wealth or poverty, freedom or servitude, dignity or dependency." The crowd listened in rapt silence as he outlined the choices before them. He spoke of the American offer: immediate investment and rapid development, but at the cost of permanent foreign control. He described the Chinese proposal: more favorable terms but still dependent on foreign expertise and decision-making. "Both offers promise prosperity," Traoré continued, "but prosperity as subjects in our own land. They offer us comfort but not control. They promise wealth but not sovereignty." A voice from the crowd called out in more, "But can we develop our oil alone? Do we have the knowledge and capital to succeed without foreign masters?" Traoré's response drew on the deep well of African resilience and determination. "When our ancestors built the great kingdoms of Ouagadougou and Yatenga, did they wait for foreign permission? When they resisted colonial conquest, did they surrender because the enemy had superior weapons? When Thomas Sankara transformed our nation in 4 short years, did he accept that change was impossible?" The crowd began to murmur approval, their voices building like a storm gathering strength. "We have survived slavery, colonialism and decades of exploitation," Traoré continued, his voice rising with passion. "We have fed ourselves from our own soil, built our own homes with our own hands, and raised our own children to be proud of their heritage. Why should we believe we cannot learn to extract our own oil, refine our own petroleum, and sell our own resources? The stadium erupted in cheers, voices raised in multiple languages but united in purpose. Traditional praise singers began chanting Traoré's name, their voices weaving together in the polyphonic harmony that had celebrated African achievements for centuries. But not everyone was convinced. An elderly man, supported by his walking stick, rose from his seat. "Young captain," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of advanced age, "your words inspire us, but inspiration doesn't drill oil wells or build refineries. What if we fail? What if our children suffer while we learn through costly mistakes?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a cooking fire, reflecting the genuine fears of a people who had seen too many grand promises lead to bitter disappointment. Traoré's response acknowledged both the risk and the necessity of their chosen path. "Papa," he replied, using the respectful term for an elder, "failure is possible, but surrender is certain death. If we accept foreign control over our resources, we may prosper temporarily, but our children will remain forever dependent on foreign charity. If we choose the difficult path of independence, we may struggle initially, but our grandchildren will inherit true sovereignty." The old man nodded slowly, his weathered face reflecting the wisdom of someone who had lived through multiple attempts at African Renaissance. "Then we must choose the path of our ancestors," he said, his voice carrying across the stadium. "The path of resistance and self-reliance, no matter how difficult." The crowd's response was thunderous, voices raised in songs of solidarity and determination. At that moment, Traoré knew he had received the mandate he sought, not just governmental authority, but the trust and commitment of the Burkinabe people. The implementation of Burkina Faso's independent oil development strategy proved as challenging as its critics had predicted. Without a single major partner providing comprehensive support, every aspect of the project required careful coordination and management. The first phase focused on establishing the National Petroleum Institute, housed in a converted government building in Ouagadougou. Dr. Yakuba Ouedraogo, a petroleum engineer who had spent 2 decades working for international oil companies, returned home to lead the institute's development. "We're building something unprecedented," Dr. Ouedraogo explained to his initial team of 12 Burkinabe engineers. "An African-controlled oil industry managed by Africans for African benefit. The technical challenges are significant, but the political and economic challenges are even greater." The institute's first priority was developing local expertise through intensive training programs. Partnerships with universities in Norway, Brazil, and South Africa provided advanced technical education for promising students, while experienced professionals from these countries served as temporary consultants and trainers. Financing proved equally complex. Traditional sources of oil industry funding, American and European banks, multilateral development institutions, remained reluctant to support Burkina Faso's unconventional approach. Instead, the nation turned to alternative funding sources: Islamic development banks, sovereign wealth funds from Gulf states, and even crowdfunding platforms that attracted support from the African diaspora worldwide. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, built on North Sea oil revenues, agreed to provide technical assistance and partial funding for Burkina Faso's development program. The Norwegian government, long committed to responsible resource extraction, saw an opportunity to support an African-led alternative to traditional exploitation models. "We remember our own early days in oil development," explained Astrid Nordahl, the Norwegian technical advisor who helped design Burkina Faso's environmental protection protocols. "We made mistakes and learned from them. If we can help Burkina Faso avoid some of those mistakes while maintaining control over your own resources, it serves both our interests and the cause of global justice." The Norwegian partnership provided crucial technical expertise without demanding operational control. Norwegian engineers worked alongside their Burkinabe counterparts, transferring knowledge and skills while ensuring that all major decisions remained in African hands. Environmental protection became a cornerstone of Burkina Faso's approach, reflecting both international best practices and traditional African values of environmental stewardship. The development program included comprehensive environmental impact assessments, community consultation processes, and revenue-sharing mechanisms that ensured local communities benefited directly from oil extraction. Chief Naba Kango, whose traditional authority covered some of the most promising oil fields, became an unexpected advocate for careful development. "The earth has given us this gift," he explained to community meetings, "but gifts come with responsibilities. We must extract this oil in a way that honors our ancestors and protects our children's future. 3 years after the initial oil discovery, Burkina Faso's first independently operated oil well began production. The ceremony marking this milestone took place not in the sterile environment of corporate boardrooms but in the sacred grove where Chief Naba Kango had first blessed the project. Traditional drummers provided rhythm for the celebration, their beats echoing across the landscape where modern drilling equipment stood alongside ancient baobab trees. The symbolism was powerful, old and new, traditional and modern, African and universal, all working together in harmony. Traoré stood before the assembled crowd, his face bearing the lines of someone who had carried the weight of a nation's dreams through years of struggle and uncertainty. The first barrel of Burkinabe oil extracted by Burkinabe hands, refined by Burkinabe expertise, sold under Burkinabe terms represented more than economic achievement. It embodied the possibility of true independence in an interconnected world. Today, he said, his voice carrying across the gathering like the call of morning prayers, we prove that Africa can develop its own resources without surrendering its dignity. This oil belongs to the children of Burkina Faso, and it will serve their future, not foreign shareholders. The crowd erupted in celebration, voices raised in praise songs that had once celebrated military victories and successful harvests. Women ululated in the traditional manner, their voices creating a tapestry of joy that seemed to lift the spirits of the ancestors themselves. But the celebration was tempered by the knowledge that greater challenges lay ahead. The first well was proof of concept, not guarantee of success. Full-scale development would require massive investment, continuous technical innovation, and the political will to resist external pressure that would inevitably intensify as Burkina Faso's model proved viable. News of Burkina Faso's successful independent oil production spread across Africa like wildfire. In Nigeria, where decades of oil wealth had enriched foreign companies while leaving local communities impoverished, activists began demanding renegotiation of existing contracts. In Ghana, where recent oil discoveries had followed traditional exploitation patterns, youth movements called for Burkina Faso-style sovereignty over natural resources. The reaction from international oil companies was swift and predictable. James Whitmore, representing the American consortium, appeared on international news programs warning of the dangerous precedent set by Burkina Faso's approach. What we're seeing is economic nationalism that threatens global energy security, he declared on CNN International. These resources require international expertise and capital to develop efficiently. Burkina Faso's experiment may produce short-term political benefits, but it will ultimately harm both the nation and global energy markets. The Chinese response was more measured but equally concerned. Ambassador Li Wei, speaking at a conference on African development, emphasized the importance of practical cooperation over ideological purism. While we respect national sovereignty, Li Wei said, development requires partnership between those who have resources and those who have expertise. Isolation may preserve dignity, but it doesn't feed hungry children or build modern infrastructure. The comments revealed the deep discomfort that Burkina Faso's success created among established powers. If a small, landlocked nation could successfully develop its oil resources independently, what prevented larger, more resource-rich countries from following the same path? In Washington, policymakers quietly discussed strategies for containing what they termed resource nationalism. The concern was not merely economic but strategic. American influence in Africa depended partly on African dependence on American expertise and capital. By the 5th year of independent oil production, Burkina Faso had achieved remarkable transformation. The National Petroleum Institute had grown into a world-class training facility, attracting students from across Africa. The nation's oil revenues, carefully managed through a sovereign wealth fund modeled on Norway's example, had funded massive infrastructure development, education expansion, and healthcare improvements. The statistics told a story of genuine progress. Literacy rates had increased by 40%, infant mortality had dropped by half, and rural access to clean water had nearly doubled. Unlike other oil-producing nations where wealth concentrated in the hands of political elites, Burkina Faso's transparent revenue management system ensured that oil wealth benefited all citizens. But success brought new challenges. The discovery of additional oil fields created pressure for rapid expansion, testing the nation's commitment to careful, sustainable development. Young engineers, trained in the world's best universities and returning with advanced technical skills, sometimes chafed at the deliberate pace of development. We could triple our production within 2 years, argued Dr. Salif Ouattara, a recent graduate from the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Our cautious approach is costing us billions in potential revenue. Dr. Yakuba Ouedraogo, now the Institute's director, understood the tension between ambition and prudence. Our goal is not maximum extraction but sustainable development, he replied during a heated faculty meeting. We've seen what happens when oil wealth comes too quickly. It corrupts institutions, destroys social cohesion, and leaves nations worse off than before discovery. The debate reflected a deeper philosophical question. Could Burkina Faso maintain its values-based approach to development while competing in a global economy that rewarded speed and efficiency over sustainability and equity? Traoré, now in his second term as president after winning a landslide election, faced the same pressures that had corrupted leaders across the continent. Oil wealth created opportunities for enrichment, both legal and illegal, that tested even the most committed public servants. The temptation was made manifest when a consortium of international investors offered to purchase a 25% stake in Burkina Faso's oil operations for $12 billion, money that could fund development projects across the nation. The offer came with guarantees of operational independence and promises of technical assistance. It's not about control, explained Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the British financier who led the consortium. We're offering capital for expansion in exchange for a minority stake in future profits. Burkina Faso maintains operational control while accessing the resources needed for rapid development. The proposal sparked intense national debate. Supporters argued that 25% foreign ownership was acceptable if it accelerated development and improved living standards. Critics warned that any foreign ownership represented the beginning of a slippery slope toward renewed dependence. As the nation debated its future, Traoré found himself once again in his grandmother's compound, seeking the wisdom that had guided his most difficult decisions. Mama Fatimata, now approaching her 100th birthday, had become a national symbol of continuity and traditional values. Numa, she said, her voice still strong despite her advanced age, you carry the burden of choosing between today's needs and tomorrow's freedom. Tell me, what do your dreams reveal? Traoré knelt beside her mat, accepting the bowl of millet porridge that had become ritual in their conversations. I dream of schools and hospitals, of roads that connect our villages, of young people who can compete with anyone in the world. But I also dream of chains disguised as gifts, of promises that become prisons. The old woman's weathered hands worked steadily at her grinding, the rhythm of pestle against mortar providing a meditative background to their conversation. When I was young, she said, a merchant came to our village offering to buy our grain harvest. He promised good prices, regular payments, and guaranteed markets. Many farmers signed contracts with him. And what happened? Traoré asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. The first year he kept his promises. The second year he reduced prices, saying market conditions had changed. By the third year he owned half the village's farmland and paid whatever he chose. The farmers who had signed contracts had become workers on their own land. The parallel to Burkina Faso's current situation was clear. But Mama, what if we need the capital to compete? What if our careful approach leaves us behind while other nations race ahead? Mama Fatimata's eyes, clouded with age but bright with understanding, fixed on her grandson. The tortoise and the hare, my child. Speed without direction leads to exhaustion. Persistence with purpose leads to victory. Her words carried the weight of accumulated wisdom, but Traoré understood that the decision ultimately rested with the Burkinabe people. The choice between maintaining complete sovereignty and accepting partial foreign ownership would define the next generation of their nation's development. The national referendum on foreign investment attracted international attention as a test of African commitment to sovereignty versus development. Campaign rallies filled stadiums across the country, with passionate advocates on both sides making their cases to the people. Aminata Ouedraogo, now serving as Prime Minister, led the campaign for maintaining complete national control. We have proven that we can develop our resources independently, she declared at a rally in Bobo Dioulasso. Why should we surrender what we have built with our own hands? Why should we share our children's inheritance with foreign shareholders? The opposing campaign, led by respected economist Dr. Boukari Sawadogo, argued for pragmatic compromise. 25% foreign ownership is not surrender, he insisted. It's a smart business that will accelerate our development by decades. We can maintain control while accessing the capital needed to compete globally. The debate played out in maquis restaurants, at market stalls, and in village squares across the nation. Traditional griots composed songs supporting each position, their musical arguments carrying the emotional weight that statistics and economic projections could not match. In the sacred grove where the oil journey had begun, Chief Naba Kengo convened a gathering of traditional leaders to seek guidance from the ancestors. The ceremony, conducted according to ancient protocols, involved prayers, libations, and the casting of traditional divination tools. The spirits speak of balance, Chief Naba Kengo announced after hours of consultation. They warn against the pride that refuses all help and the greed that accepts any offer. The path forward requires wisdom, not ideology. The referendum campaign revealed deep divisions within Burkinabe society. Urban populations, more exposed to global economic pressures, tended to support limited foreign investment. Rural communities, with stronger connections to traditional values and deeper suspicion of foreign influence, favored maintaining complete independence. Young people, educated in the world's universities and comfortable with global connections, generally supported the investment proposal. Older generations who had lived through colonialism and its aftermath, overwhelmingly opposed any foreign ownership of national resources. On referendum day, polling stations across Burkina Faso opened before dawn to accommodate the massive turnout. In villages where literacy rates remained low, election officials read the ballot question aloud in local languages, ensuring that every citizen could participate regardless of educational background. The question was simple but profound. Should Burkina Faso accept foreign investment in its oil operations in exchange for minority ownership stakes, or should the nation maintain complete national control over its petroleum resources? Traoré cast his vote in his hometown of Kédougou, surrounded by the community that had shaped his values and worldview. The symbolic weight of the moment was not lost on him. A decision that would define his nation's future, made not by politicians or foreign investors but by the people themselves. As results trickled in throughout the day, a clear pattern emerged. The vote was closer than many had anticipated, reflecting the genuine complexity of the choice facing the nation. Urban areas supported the investment proposal by significant margins, while rural regions opposed it by even larger margins. The final result, announced as the sun set over Ouagadougou, was decisive. 58% of Burkinabe voters chose to maintain complete national control over their oil resources, rejecting foreign investment despite its potential benefits. The international reaction was swift and predictable. Financial markets expressed concern about Burkina Faso's rejection of pragmatic economic policies, while development experts warned of missed opportunities and economic isolation. But in the streets of Ouagadougou, Bobo de Lasso, and villages across the nation, the response was celebration. The people had chosen dignity over dependence, sovereignty over speed, and their decision would echo across a continent where similar choices awaited. 10 years after the initial oil discovery, Burkina Faso had become a model for resource-rich developing nations worldwide. The National Petroleum Institute had trained engineers and technicians for a dozen African countries, while the nation's sovereign wealth fund had grown to rival those of established oil powers. The decision to reject foreign investment had not been without cost. Development had proceeded more slowly than it might have with massive foreign capital, and some opportunities had been lost to more aggressive competitors. But the benefits of complete sovereignty had proven transformative. Unlike other oil-producing nations where wealth concentrated among elites, Burkina Faso's transparent revenue management system had created broad-based prosperity. Rural communities had access to clean water, reliable electricity, and modern healthcare. Urban centers had grown into regional hubs of education and technology. Most importantly, the nation had maintained its soul. The values that had guided the independence struggle, self-reliance, community solidarity, and resistance to external domination, had survived the test of oil wealth. Traoré, now in his final year as president, reflected on the journey during a ceremony marking the 10th anniversary of the first oil discovery. Standing once again in the sacred grove where the adventure had begun, he addressed a gathering that included many of the same faces who had participated in that first community consultation. "We chose the difficult path," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a decade's struggles and achievements. "We could have accepted foreign partnerships that would have made us rich quickly but kept us dependent permanently. Instead, we chose to learn, to build, and to control our own destiny." The crowd, now including children who had grown up in an oil-rich Burkina Faso, listened with the respect due to someone who had guided them through their nation's most transformative period. These young people, educated in schools built with oil revenues and trained in institutions created by national determination, represented the ultimate vindication of the choices made a decade earlier. Chief Naba Kengo, now in his 80s but still sharp, rose to address the gathering. "Our children will inherit what we have built," he said, his voice carrying across the grove. They will inherit oil wells operated by Burkinabe hands, refineries managed by Burkinabe mines, and revenues controlled by Burkinabe institutions. Most importantly, they will inherit the knowledge that they can shape their own future. The ceremony concluded with traditional songs and dances that had celebrated African achievements for centuries. But these were not merely nostalgic performances of cultural preservation. They were living expressions of values that had guided a small nation to achieve something unprecedented: the transformation of natural resources into genuine sovereignty. As the sun set over the Sahel, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the oil derricks stood silhouetted against the horizon. They were no longer symbols of foreign exploitation but monuments to African determination. The black gold beneath the red earth had become the foundation not just of prosperity but of dignity, not just of wealth but of independence. In the end, Burkina Faso's story was not unique because of its oil discovery. Many nations had found petroleum beneath their soil. It was unique because its people had chosen to remain masters of their own resources, to learn rather than surrender, to build rather than accept, to struggle rather than submit. The choice between foreign dependency and national sovereignty was not merely economic or political. It was fundamentally about the kind of people they chose to be. In choosing the difficult path of independence, they had chosen to be architects of their own destiny rather than beneficiaries of foreign charity. The black gold beneath the sacred ground had become the foundation of a new African renaissance, one barrel of independently extracted oil at a time.